Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, May 24th, 2023, and these are the three questions that we're going to be answering today as we get into the week before NAFSA. And as we do each week, we cover these three questions that come out of news stories that we've seen developing over the past few weeks. And in particular, we have a newsletter that goes out on Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern. A couple different ways you can subscribe to that, either through our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. Enter in your details. You'll get that email newsletter version delivered to your inbox each Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And that includes top social media and international education news stories, and oftentimes where those overlap, and our quick hot takes on what those news stories mean for us in international ed. And then Wednesdays, we go in more in depth into three of those themes that we see developing throughout those news stories, and give a little bit more detailed perspective on how we think this might impact what we do in international ed and what you might be able to do about it. And as I mentioned, there are two ways to do that, either direct through our website, and I'll drop the link to our most recent edition of the newsletter into the chat as well. And the other way you can get it is via LinkedIn. If you prefer to get your international ed news on that platform, I'll drop the link to this week's edition. You can click the subscribe button and you can get added to that. Well over 1,000 subscribers on both of these versions combined. So very happy to be coming to you live each week, either through this midweek roundup or through that newsletter. So thanks for making us a part of your international edification. Now let's get right to the questions. First up, one of the big bad questions we get often and cover in various ways on the roundup and throughout the newsletter over the last 4 or 5 years, ever since we started this initiative, is the importance of China to U.S. higher education. And the question now is, how important is China to U.S. higher education? And this question comes up as a result of recent legislative action that the state of Florida has taken to, in effect, ban public institutions from having relationships with Chinese universities and other entities in China. There's a similar bill that also has some anti-DEI provisions that also passed in Florida that is making its way through the state legislature in Ohio currently. And the Ohio bill, SB 83, passed the Senate last week. And immediately before the Senate voted on that, Ohio State, in an unusual move, came out fully against that measure because of its impact on both DEI and international collaboration with entities and organizations, institutions in China. So that's an unusual thing for a state university to speak publicly against a bill that has had overwhelming bipartisan, well, not overwhelming bipartisan, but it had overwhelming support. I think it was 28-10 voted in favor of that in the Senate. And then it's got to make its way through the state house, and then to Governor DeWine if it passes the House for signature. The impact of this kind of legislation, and we're seeing this pop up, where it seems like everything is getting politicized in one way or another, whether you're in a red state or a blue state or a purple state, or these kinds of questions are coming up in state legislatures, not just at the national level. The questions of DEI, which have become such an important part of how universities and colleges have sought to broaden their reach and their level of support for students from across a range of socioeconomic, racial, cultural, gender type questions, and their ability to fit in on campus and find the resources that they need to succeed. In some places, that's been taken to the extreme. In other places, it's being used as in California public universities, it's being used as a litmus test in some ways. It's seen as a litmus test, a DEI statement that applicants have to agree to when they're interviewed and potentially hired. So there's a lot of politics that's gone into this DEI discussion. It's been a little bit of a unfortunate side effect of what the conversation and the intent of initial DEI work been meant to provide universities and its students. So China has gotten wrapped up in this in these legislative attempts in Florida and potentially in Ohio, where it would have a very hard and fast ban on public institutions in that state from having relationships with institutions in China. That impacts obviously those larger schools, that universities that have had relationships for decades with institutions in China. We've been involved looking in a relationship with a school in Florida, public school in Florida, that's no longer able to continue doing a particular program with a Chinese partner. And we've been asked to come in and see if we can do something to take their place, because we're not in a state that right now is potentially going that far to that extreme with banning public institutions from working with institutions in China. So this is something that has real life consequences for universities that are doing work in China, whether it's sending students to study abroad through partner institutions, receiving students, research collaboration. All of that is impossible now. If certainly in Florida for public institutions, they may be able to still receive students, but not through partner institutions, not through that kind of formal relationship, institution-institution relationship that is now banned by Florida law. That might happen in Ohio as well, in terms of public institutions facing a similar ban on relationships with Chinese institutions. So we'll see where that goes. But it's coming on the heels of a post-pandemic hope that there was going to be a rebound of some sorts in student flows from China to the U.S. They have certainly kept up in terms of flows to the U.K. predominantly for one-year master's programs, which now we'll talk a little bit later in the podcast, in the roundup, about that impact in the U.K. But Australia's seen not as robust a rebounding of student interest. We've seen that New Zealand is seeing a little bit more Chinese interest there. But the U.S. has not seen as significant an interest. And part of the challenges are basic logistics. It's not that they haven't been able to go and get visas. It's because they've only up until late December, early January, even had the ability to travel again overseas due to travel restrictions in place by the government. And then after being allowed to travel again, the ways that, for students who were looking to start in January, the ways that they would have to have gone to fly directly to the U.S. Or they wouldn't be able to fly directly in most cases, and they would have to go through third-party countries before they could come and do rather circuitous routes to get to us. It sounded like a Canadian there, routes, but circuitous routes to get to us, and they would be very expensive. I'm going to be taking a trip with our provost and one of our faculty members to China middle of June, to the end of June, and flights are outrageous. First time I looked a month ago, they were about $10,000 for flights into China because there were so few of them. But in the last week or two, there's been more flights opening up, so prices are dropping down from $10,000 to $4,000. So still pretty significantly above average in terms of what you need to pay to get into China or out of China, and for that matter. So China started reopening, and when they reopened flights in January, started with their regional partners that they have the most business with and trade with. That made sense. And now they're slowly expanding to the rest of the world. And hopefully by this fall, those flights will be up and available again for Chinese students to come back in more significant numbers than they had been able to in the spring. So we'll keep our fingers crossed, and certainly we're going in terms of our relationships in China. We're investing heavily in China, time and effort and energy, and spending a couple of weeks there at the end of June to be introduced to some key potential partners, one of which we've already be starting to work with as of next June for July for a summer program for some of our hospitality students. But we're looking to build relationships, not cut back. We're fortunate, perhaps we're in a purple state where it's it's a blue purple state, but in terms of leadership, more purple probably at this point. But it's one that where these kind of anti-China, anti-DEI kind of sentiments haven't flared up, and that would be very difficult to do at a campus like UNLV, where our campus is 67% diverse, racial ethnic diversity. So we already have that as part of our DNA. So it'd be very hard to not allow DEI. But anyway, beside the point. But related to China, there's certainly a lot of institutions that are, if particularly public institutions, if they're in red states, that are being really hesitant about going too far, too quick in terms of relationships with China. We're hoping for rebounds in students, but we know that there's been a demographic downturn in Chinese undergraduate populations, which had really fueled the growth in Chinese students over the last 15 years. But starting 2016, 2017, there was already signs of a decline, and that was exacerbated by the pandemic. And we're not going to get back up to 2015, 2016 levels, I don't think, in terms of Chinese students. But we certainly, because we also know that they are increasingly being sought after by countries around the world, and major destinations might include countries you've not thought of potentially as a destination for Chinese students: Germany, France, India, potentially coming up on their radar as a place where they want to study beyond just the traditional UK, US, Canada, Australia. So we're seeing more choice that they have, and as a result, there's more options on the table. So to really attract students in significant numbers again, you're going to have to work harder to get them. And that's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately, in this wider global student mobility chase that we're all engaged in terms of knowing that we're up against competition, that students in China are applying to 4 or 5 different countries, not just different universities, but different countries when they're looking at higher ed options. So positioning yourself as an institution, a preferred destination for Chinese students, you need to really have your wits about you. You have to certainly have relationships that you're building with the right partners in country. You need to have a value proposition for students in China that speaks to the advantages, not just of your institution, and certainly you want to play on those when it comes to the issues of safety, and have the testimonials from your current Chinese students that can speak to that, because that's going to resonate with a lot of parents, especially. But you want to have that value add proposition for what is your degree going to get them, and speak specifically to the routes that your graduates, and if you can get it down to where your Chinese graduates go for further graduate education or for employment in the United States or returning home. If you're able to track any of that information, having that data is going to be more to your advantage. So you got to customize your game, you got to elevate your game, and you got to have the data and the anecdotal stories to help make your pitch for you, not just rely on what you have to say and why your institution is the best thing since sliced bread. But that's beside the point. You have to know your competition, that these students that you're going after are being sought after highly by countries all around the world, because there just are the numbers of them. But you also have to realize that you can't just go in with your traditional pitch that you have for other international students. You have to show that why you're different and why you have value to each student that you present your case to, and that's certainly something that we need to do a better job of. And in addition to the Ohio and the Florida bills we've talked about, there was one potential bright spot, and this is an interesting perspective you don't always see, but it was a Global Times article last week that was entitled "Chinese International Student Brings the National Flag to the Graduation Ceremony and Receives Applause." And this is interesting. It was a graduation ceremony in the United States. They don't identify which university it was, but it's a Chinese student in his cap and gown, carrying proudly his Chinese national flag and walking it down. And that's the fact that the article points out that the student received applause for that. And I think this is something I would want to hold on to and say, okay, there's hope yet, and it's not all anti-China rhetoric that seems to get politicized across the country in all our news media outlets. The reality is, on the ground, on campus, our Chinese students are seen as valued assets to our campuses, and that they are treated well. They're treated with respect. They're treated with applause when they're showing their pride in their own country. And there's nothing wrong with that. We do the same thing for our students when they go abroad. They have their flags. We tell them not to be too ugly American when they're out there, when we're sending students abroad for study. But you see that we're happy that they're taking pride in who they are and their culture and where they're from, and that's something we celebrate in our international offices on our campuses and hopefully across our campuses in general. That's something we value, and the fact that this is getting play back in China is a good thing, I think, because it's showing that it's not all the anti-Asian, anti-China rhetoric that you see, that they can and are being treated with respect when they come. So I think that's a potential sliver of bright news that you want to certainly hold on to, and I think there's a lot of value in terms of when we talk about. You can't put enough value, I think, on on what these current students are living now and those experiences, and how they can speak most directly to prospective students in their home countries. And the more we can leverage that in how we recruit in China or in any nation around the world, having that personal connection, having that story that can be shared peer-to-peer, that matters and has value far beyond anything you could do individually on your own travels, your own relationships that you might have overseas. So how important is China to the U.S. higher education scene? It's vital, and it's losing those relationships can dramatically alter the landscape of some colleges and universities around the country, particularly in terms of partnerships, if laws like what has happened in Florida and potentially in Ohio. It will be interesting to see what the long-term impact is on student flows, seeing that a state has now banned public universities from having relationships with Chinese universities. Will that trickle down to, well, Chinese students are going to see that, well, we're not welcome in Florida. The state may have other ways of getting around that, but that's certainly going to be an impression that is going to become reality for those students in terms of how they're viewed, how they think they're going to be viewed if they come to a university in Florida. It's very unfortunate because I know many colleagues at Florida institutions, public and private, that are seeing this as potentially a significant blow to their ability to recruit students from the mainland China. So we'll see where it goes, but it is a vital piece, and there's still 30% of our international students, maybe a little less now, are from China. It's still a big driver of our numbers each year. India is going to overtake China this year, just in terms of raw numbers in the U.S. But China and India are always going to be 1 and 2, so we can't ignore that big of a market. So that's where we're coming from on question number 1. Question 2, what South and East Asian markets are best beyond India and China? So this is referencing a couple of important articles our friends at INTED have put out, and it's entitled When Traditional Markets Weaken, Look to Asia, Part 1 and Part 2. The first part talks about Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and I believe... First one starts with South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Japan as the 4 in that article. And the second one focuses on Nepal, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. And in terms of numbers, those are the top senders. Each of them are top 25 countries sending to the United States. Very big players. We've known about. We already know India and China. But they're far and away number 1 and number 2. But these markets, we already know 70% of all international students in the U.S. come from Asia. So it's obvious that there are going to be other pockets beyond India and China that we can and should be focusing on. So the INTED articles, both of which will be in the chat, these were both in the newsletter on Monday. They talk through each of the different countries, what the relative strengths are, the kinds of opportunities that and things that you need to be aware of if you're going to be recruiting there. Talks about industries in each of these countries. I like this bit. the economic data for each of the countries. What are the rising industries include in that interest in that country? So you can find ways to potentially promote your programs, academic programs, to meet those needs, meet the demand that is obviously in those countries. And one of the countries that's on this list in the second part is Indonesia. I want to talk a little bit about that country, because it is, believe it or not, the fourth most populous country in the world after China, India, U.S., and then Indonesia. It is with over 267 million people, I think. So it is a market that not enough U.S. schools spend a lot of time in. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It takes forever to get there, even if you're in a California location. I'm potentially going there later this fall, and it's anywhere from a 34 to a 44-hour trip just to get there. So a lot of, hopefully a lot more other colleagues who have gone there before, they have some interesting travel stories getting there and back. But it's a long trip anyway. But it is such a huge market. Why does it get ignored? I think probably because Australia has traditionally done well there. They don't send volumes of students overseas for a country its size. I think the U.S. has about 8,000 as of the last Open Doors count from students from Indonesia in the United States. There is a government scholarship program. It's one of those more selective ones where if you're top 100, top 200, you can get in the global rankings. So we have one program that's on their rankings, but that might be a reason to get our foot in the door there. We've never been, as I mentioned, at UNLV up until this past year, we didn't do international student recruitment travel. We're still doing most of it virtually, but I'm doing partnerships, and eventually this year we may be getting into doing some direct travel. So we're looking at this as a market we need to be focusing on, opportunities for partnerships as well, institutional partnerships. But as a country that I think doesn't get enough attention, and certainly one, there's going to be a delegation from the Indonesian Scholarship Group that'll be at NAFSA next week. They've set up a couple different events. There's a kind of a meet and greet reception, and there's also one-on-ones that you can get with kind of the coordinators of that group. Also simultaneously got contacted by Education USA in Indonesia, said, hey, you're on this government scholarship list. We're doing all these fairs that target these students in October. You should come. There's also an institution that might want to talk to you. So there's a nice coordination of effort going on right now related around Indonesia. So I'm very happy to see that. And certainly will hopefully lead to some potential partnerships and student flows in the coming year for us. But Indonesia's of the ones on that list, it's probably the one that kind of confounds most U.S. experts in terms of why we don't do better there, because it's closer to Australia. It's right in their backyard. Maybe we don't think we have as tight a grip or ability to get in there. There's certainly going to be some of that competition, and it's a good that we're aware of that going in. But we're certainly Indonesia, Malaysia as well, that region in Southeast Asia, there's certainly plenty of opportunity there for as with any country really, if you understand it well enough, you do your homework, and you have identified potential partners in that country to help you find your way, either developing schools that you're going to work with, partnerships that you want to build with universities, whatever it might be, agents, whatever, having that initiative to go all in a country does require some planning and forethought, and this is something that as markets develop, you want to have a 2-3 year plan for developing a presence in a market. It's not something that you're going to get automatically 10 students next year because you did a trip to Indonesia. That's not going to happen in most cases, but it starts the ball rolling on generating momentum and repeated presence and showing that you're there. That's how you build brand in the market when you haven't been there anywhere before. So that's certainly a big challenge, and one that kudos to the INTED boys and girls, great team there for putting together these content articles on some of the best markets outside of India and China in East and South Asia. So that's question number 2. Our final question of the day is one that it's been coming for a while. It's been coming since the Sunak government took office late last year, and where there was some hope in the international ed community in the UK that the initial bluster about, well, we net migration numbers are up and this year substantially, and it's because international students were bringing their families with them for these one-year master's degree programs. It was about students coming for low-quality degrees from UK universities. It was a little bit of an elitist approach, if to be fair, about from the government, from the leadership, from the Prime Minister himself, about value of different programs in the UK, and that they should only be coming to the best institutions rather than every other country. Canada, Australia, U.S. Allows international students to come in numbers to all levels of education, even down to elementary school in the U.S. and other countries. But at vocational education, that seems to be completely off the radar or wish list of anything for the Sunak government. But his Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, certainly pushed the boat out very quickly after she became Home Secretary for the second time in a short span, to allow to shine a light on the net migration numbers that most international educators in the UK will say international students shouldn't be counted in the net migration numbers, but are because they're not technically an immigrant visa, even though they can legally transfer into those statuses. The fear is all the dependents that have come with these students. The UK universities have seen spikes in the last 3 years, particularly during the pandemic and beyond, for their one-year master's degree programs. So not as expensive as a 2-year stay in the US, 1 year of living expenses in addition. So seen as a very easy way to get into the UK. But now they've started to bring their dependents with them, their spouses and children. And the drain, in the UK terms, from the government terms, the drain on public resources, health, NHS, and schools, and food, and all of that, it's seen as too significant a jump. And as a result, the UK government has made the decision, and it sounds like it's happened this week. They're now going to prohibit one-year master's degree students coming from overseas to the UK from bringing dependents. So in order to get that net migration number under control, all in the name of net migration control. So as a result, this is going back to that perspective thing that we talked about, and we talk about regularly on the Roundup. How will this decision be viewed, even though it's targeting just those students coming for one-year master's degree programs from not being able to bring dependents? How will this be viewed you can't bring your family. You just have to come by yourself. Is that going to be seen in overseas markets as it's just a small group of students? No, it's going to be the majority of new students coming are going to be now prohibited from bringing in dependents. How many of the last year's this is the numbers I don't know, and I'd love to hear it from some of my UK colleagues, but how many of those new one-year master's degree students brought dependents with them, and how many more of them than there are students, that type of thing. I haven't seen that data, but that is akin to what I would see if this decision getting made is akin to what, in terms of impact, akin to what the Trump travel bans did during his right after he was inaugurated, where he suddenly said 7 countries, they banned travel from those 7 countries to the United States, because Muslim majority countries primarily. Even though there were exemptions in there for students, the numbers dried up from those countries fairly quickly as a result of the travel ban. But you also saw a wider view of that in 17, 18, 19, when those travel bans how that was being viewed by students and their parents in other countries, even though it was a Muslim majority country travel ban. The view was that the United States was not as welcoming to international students, and this was a symptom of that, this travel ban. I think this move by the UK government to prohibit dependents coming with students that are attending UK universities for one-year master's programs, that impact can be as significant, as negative as the Muslim travel bans were in the U.S. in 2017 and 18 and onward during the Trump administration. So I think it's really unfortunate, and I think that UK universities, they had just peaked. They hit their 2030 goal for international students 8 years early. There were over 680,000, I think, or 630,000 international students in the UK last year. So doing really well, and numbers were going well. But they were on a churn and burn cycle on these one-year master's students that may dry up in terms of the volume that they're going to see, and will certainly be lessened in what they're going to see in the next couple of years as a result, and maybe that will have knock-on impact as well. But there's some real damage that's going to be done, real kind of shooting yourself in the foot just when you're up. Maybe it's popping, whatever metaphor you want to use here, popping the balloon of success. When you're at your peak, you pop that balloon and then it comes right back down. So all the enthusiasm that had been built up, and we really did well during the pandemic. We've come out stronger, but then they've got the housing crises, they've got the food insecurity issues that we've seen. Now we have this dependent ban. So there's a lot of things that the UK government has done that have not helped, and certainly not built upon a very solid foundation that had been built, and a platform for success to take it to the next level was really there. But now seems to have been undermined quite considerably by what the UK government has done. So I'll be interested to chat with my British colleagues next week over a few beverages at receptions during the week, but as to what their opinions are and what's next for them and how that impacts what they're going to do in the next recruitment cycle. But certainly a lot of unanswered questions from what's next in the UK, but hopefully they will get some resolution to this, and hopefully a turnaround in policy in the next weeks or months. Well, that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup, and we want to thank you for joining the conversation. It's really good to see some people in the chat today. But I do want to say next week we'll be doing our traditional live from the expo floor of the NAFSA exhibition hall. So I'll be coming to you live Wednesday next week at May 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern. Live from the Expo Hall. For those that are going to NAFSA, hopefully catch up with you then. If not, we'll look forward to chatting with you in the weeks to come. So thanks very much.